There are moments in history when obsession and power intersect, creating witnesses to events that will shape the world. Consider for a moment that in 1932, a 19-year-old woman stood in the rain for 4 hours outside Palazzo Venezia in Rome. She was not protesting. She was not seeking employment. She was waiting for one glimpse of a man who would lead her nation to ruin, and she was willing to endure any discomfort for that single moment of connection. Her name was Claretta Petacci, though history would know her as Clara, and her story represents one of the most extraordinary cases of proximity to power that the 20th century would produce. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. The obsession had begun 5 years earlier, when Clara was just 14 years old. Imagine a young girl, daughter of privilege, composing poems to a man nearly 30 years her senior. Not casual verses, but declarations of eternal devotion addressed to Il Duce, Benito Mussolini, the fascist leader who had seized control of Italy through violence and charisma in equal measure. She sent these poems regularly, a teenage heart pouring itself onto paper and dispatching those papers to the most powerful man in the nation. It was the kind of infatuation that parents dismiss, that friends find bewildering, that psychologists would later analyze as the first warning sign of what was to come. But Clara's obsession was not destined to remain unrequited fantasy. By the time she reached 24 years of age, she had achieved what her 14-year-old self could only dream of. She commanded her own villa in Rome, a residence that spoke of wealth and influence. She maintained a staff of servants who attended to her every need, and most remarkably, she held secrets that, if revealed, could topple governments and rewrite the political landscape of Europe. Clara's background provided unusual preparation for the role she would eventually play. Her father, Francesco Petacci, served as physician to the Vatican, a position that placed the family at the intersection of religious authority and political power. In that world, in those rooms where influential men gathered, secrets were currency. The young Clara learned early that knowledge was power, that discretion was valuable, and that being present in the right moment could change everything. The Petacci family apartment overlooked Piazza Venezia, that grand square in central Rome where crowds gathered to hear Mussolini's speeches. She could look down from her window and see history unfolding. She could not know, in those early years, that she would look down from that same vantage point at the spot where her own body would hang 13 years later. The documented meetings between Clara and Mussolini number over 200. These were not brief encounters or formal audiences. These were extended sessions held in the hidden rooms of Villa Torlonia, Mussolini's official residence, spaces designed for privacy and secrecy. With each meeting, Clara's knowledge deepened. She became privy to information that even Mussolini's closest advisors did not possess. She learned about his private terrors, the fears that haunted a man who publicly displayed only strength and certainty. Consider what she discovered about his health. Mussolini suffered from stomach cancer, a diagnosis he concealed from the Italian people with absolute determination. A leader cannot appear weak, cannot show vulnerability, and so the pain was hidden, the treatments kept secret. Clara knew. She also knew about his syphilis, the treatments for which drove him to episodes of madness. The disease affected his judgment, his temperament, his capacity to lead rationally. Clara witnessed these transformations. She saw the drugs, the cocaine that fueled his 18-hour workdays, the artificial energy that kept a sick man functioning as though he were invincible. The political secrets she accumulated were equally explosive. Clara learned about 7 separate assassination attempts that Mussolini had survived. She knew the names of the conspirators, and more disturbingly, she knew that some of those conspirators remained within his government, their treason undetected or deliberately ignored. She was told about 3 secret bunkers constructed beneath Rome, elaborate underground facilities where Mussolini planned to make his final stand if the regime collapsed. These were not abstractions or rumors. Clara knew their locations, their specifications, the supplies stored within them. Through her brother Marcello, who facilitated weapons deals between Italy and Nazi Germany, Clara gained access to an even wider circle of intelligence. Marcello's position as an intermediary in the arms trade provided him with information that flowed between Rome and Berlin, and what Marcello learned, Clara learned. She became aware of German atomic research programs, the terrifying possibility that Hitler's scientists might develop weapons of unprecedented destructive power. She knew about Allied invasion plans that Italian spies had stolen, information that could have changed the course of battles if properly exploited. And she learned about Swiss negotiations, secret discussions about ending the war that were occurring even as soldiers died by the millions on European battlefields. Had these negotiations succeeded, the war might have ended 6 months earlier. Clara knew the details, the terms being discussed, the obstacles preventing agreement. What transforms Clara's story from historical footnote to essential narrative is understanding what this knowledge meant. She was not a spy in the traditional sense. She held no official position, commanded no network of agents, reported to no intelligence service. She was something more unusual and perhaps more dangerous. She was a witness. She saw and heard things that were meant to remain hidden, and she remembered everything. In a regime built on propaganda and carefully constructed images, Clara possessed the truth behind the facade. The intimacy between Clara and Mussolini created a unique flow of information. In moments of vulnerability, in private hours when the public persona could be set aside, Mussolini revealed himself. He shared his fears about the war's progression, his doubts about Germany's ultimate victory, his concerns about the loyalty of those around him. These were not official briefings or strategic discussions. These were the unguarded admissions of a man to the woman who loved him, confessions spoken in darkness that Clara absorbed and recorded. Her recording was meticulous. Clara kept diaries, extensive journals that documented her experiences with precision and detail. She wrote in multiple colors of ink, a system that categorized different types of information. Black ink for daily events, the ordinary occurrences of life. Red ink for state secrets, the dangerous knowledge that could not be shared. Blue ink for intimate moments, the private dimensions of their relationship. This color-coded system suggests a woman who understood she was creating a historical record, who recognized that what she was witnessing and learning had significance beyond her personal experience. The psychology of Clara's devotion fascinates and disturbs in equal measure. She loved a man responsible for sending thousands to death. She adored a leader whose policies brought suffering across continents. How does such love coexist with such knowledge? The human capacity for compartmentalization, for separating personal affection from moral judgment, finds extreme expression in Clara's story. She saw Mussolini's cruelty, his vanity, his madness, and none of it diminished her devotion. If anything, the knowledge of his flaws seemed to deepen her commitment, as though she alone could see past the monster to the vulnerable man beneath. By 1943, as the war turned decisively against the Axis powers, Clara's position became increasingly precarious. The secrets she held made her both invaluable and dangerous. To those who might want to preserve aspects of the regime, she was essential. To those who might want to expose the regime's crimes, she was a treasure trove of evidence. To those who simply wanted certain truths buried, she was a threat that might need to be eliminated. Clara existed at the intersection of all these interests, aware of her value and her danger. The question that haunts her story is this: why did she stay? She came from a wealthy family with international connections. She could have fled to neutral countries, could have negotiated with immunity in exchange for her knowledge, could have simply disappeared into the chaos of wartime Europe. But she chose to remain beside Mussolini as his world collapsed. Was this love in its purest form, loyalty that transcended reason? Was it addiction to proximity to power, an inability to imagine existence without that connection? Or had she become so entangled in the machinery of secrecy that escape seemed impossible? Understanding Clara requires understanding the nature of fascism itself. The regime was not simply a political system. It was a vast apparatus of surveillance, loyalty, and fear. Those close to power were both privileged and imprisoned by that proximity. Clara enjoyed wealth and status, but she also lived under constant watch. Her movements were monitored, her conversations potentially recorded, her loyalties tested. In such an environment, knowledge became both armor and chain. What she knew protected her because she was too valuable to harm, but it also bound her because she knew too much to be allowed to leave. The Woman Who Waited in the Rain in 1932 was a girl with a romantic obsession. The woman who stood beside Mussolini in 1945 was something else entirely. A repository of secrets, a witness to evil, a keeper of truths that nations would spend decades trying to suppress or recover. Her transformation tracks the arc of fascism itself, from theatrical promise to catastrophic reality. She had sought glory and found carnage. She had pursued love and discovered complicity. As we follow Clara's journey through the remaining years of her life, we will encounter questions that extend beyond one woman's choices. We will examine how ordinary people become witnesses to extraordinary evil. We will explore the mechanisms by which states keep secrets and the ways those secrets eventually surface. We will confront the uncomfortable reality that history's most important testimonies sometimes come from those most deeply compromised by their proximity to power. Clara Petacci's story is not a tale of innocence corrupted. She chose her path with open eyes, pursuing a man and a position that brought her into the heart of darkness. But it is a story of witness, of one person's unique view into events that shaped the modern world. The documents she created, the knowledge she accumulated, the secrets she carried, all of these continue to reshape our understanding of World War II's European theatre. Every fragment of her diaries that surfaces adds detail to histories we thought complete. Every revelation from her archives challenges narratives we thought settled. In the chapters that follow, we will trace those archives through their unlikely survival. We will accompany Clara on her final desperate flight through collapsing Italy. We will stand with her at the moment of execution and explore what she might have revealed had she chosen survival over silence. But for now, simply consider the beginning. The young woman in the rain, waiting for a glimpse of power, having no concept of where that obsession would lead or what she would witness along the way. It is a beginning that contains all the elements of the tragedy to come. There exists in the archives of 20th century history a collection of documents so extraordinary, so dangerous, that nations have spent decades attempting to control, suppress, or destroy them. 5,000 pages survived fire, flood, and systematic suppression. These are the diaries of Clara Petacci, and they represent perhaps the most intimate record of fascism's inner workings ever created. When we speak of primary sources, of first-hand accounts that historians treasure, we are speaking of documents written by participants who understood they were recording history. Clara's diaries are something rarer still. They are the unguarded observations of someone who lived inside power's most private spaces, who saw what was never meant to be seen and wrote what was never meant to be preserved. The physical diaries themselves tell a story before a single word is read. Clara wrote in 3 colors of ink, a system that was not decorative but functional, a method of categorization that reveals a sophisticated understanding of information management. Black ink recorded daily events, the surface texture of her life. These entries describe social gatherings, shopping expeditions, conversations with family members, the mundane details that make up existence. Red ink marked state secrets, information whose revelation could alter political outcomes or endanger lives. Blue ink preserved intimate moments, the private emotional landscape of her relationship with Mussolini. This tricolour system suggests that Clara knew she was creating something more than a personal journal. She was building an archive, organizing information in ways that would allow future readers, perhaps including herself, to navigate different categories of knowledge. Consider what this organization reveals about her mindset. She understood that different types of information carried different levels of danger. She recognized that the secrets she recorded had value beyond her own memory. She anticipated, consciously or unconsciously, that these documents might someday serve purposes larger than private reflection. The care she took in maintaining this system, the discipline required to sustain it across thousands of pages over years of tumultuous events, speaks to a woman who saw herself as more than Mussolini's mistress. She was documenting history from a vantage point no one else occupied. The content of the red ink entries remains explosive 8 decades later. On January 19, 1943, Clara recorded an event that few historians knew occurred until fragments of her diary surfaced decades later. Adolf Hitler arrived unannounced at Villa Torlonia at 3 o'clock in the morning. Clara was present, hidden in an adjacent room, but able to hear everything. The Führer was in a state of rage about Stalingrad, where German forces were being systematically destroyed by Soviet armies. Clara described Hitler screaming at Mussolini, his voice carrying through the villa's walls, accusing the Italian leader of weakness and incompetence. What makes this entry historically invaluable is the specificity of what follows. Mussolini, according to Clara's account, did not respond with the bombast his public persona suggested. He cowered. He made excuses. He promised renewed Italian commitment to the war effort. And then Hitler made a threat that Clara recorded verbatim in her red ink. The Führer promised to deploy nerve gas if the Allied forces invaded Italy, a promise accompanied by technical details. Hitler scratched a chemical formula onto the window of Villa Torlonia with his ring, and Clara copied that formula into her diary. Whether the formula was authentic, whether Hitler possessed such weapons, whether he would have actually used them, these questions have occupied military historians and chemical weapons experts for decades. Clara's diary entry is the only known record of this midnight threat. 3 months later, on April 7, 1944, Clara documented another secret meeting, this one even more politically sensitive. Mussolini met with a representative of Winston Churchill in a Vatican safe house. The meeting's very existence contradicts the official history of unwavering Allied commitment to unconditional Axis surrender. According to Clara's detailed notes, written that same evening, the discussion centered on Italy switching sides in exchange for £40 million sterling and guarantees of Mussolini's personal safety. The terms were discussed in detail. The financial mechanisms for transferring such enormous sums were explored. The political cover that would be provided to make Italy's betrayal of Germany appear forced rather than negotiated. All of this Clara recorded in her precise handwriting. The meeting, according to her account, ultimately failed because Mussolini could not guarantee control over Italian military forces. The Allies doubted his ability to deliver on promises of cooperation, and without such guarantees, the financial incentive was meaningless. But the fact that such negotiations occurred at all, that Churchill's government was willing to pay for Italy's defection, that Mussolini was willing to consider abandoning his German allies, all of this remained hidden until Clara's diary fragments emerged. Even now, the British government has not officially acknowledged this meeting, though historians have corroborated enough details from other sources to accept Clara's account as credible. What makes these diary entries particularly valuable is not simply that they record events, but that they record the emotional and psychological dimensions of those events. Clara describes Mussolini's fear of Hitler, his recognition that Germany would lose in the war, his desperate search for any path that might preserve his own life and some remnant of his power. She captures the panic behind the propaganda, the human terror beneath the dictatorial facade. These are observations no official record would contain, insights available only to someone present in the most private moments. The survival of Clara's diaries is itself an improbable story, a tale of narrow escapes and deliberate preservation that spans decades. As the war turned against the Axis powers, Clara became increasingly concerned about the fate of her documents. She recognized that they contained information dangerous to all sides, secrets that fascists, Germans, and Allies alike might want destroyed or controlled. Her solution was to distribute the risk, to divide the diaries into multiple locations, ensuring that no single disaster or seizure could eliminate the entire archive. In 1943, Clara's sister Miriam took the first volumes, the diaries covering the early years of Clara's relationship with Mussolini, and buried them in terracotta jars beneath the garden of their family home. This was not a casual hiding place, but a deliberate archaeological approach, placing documents in sealed containers beneath earth, where they might survive fire, flood, or systematic searches. The jars remained undiscovered until 1958, when the family finally retrieved them during a clandestine nighttime excavation. By then, 15 years had passed, political circumstances had changed, but the information in those early diaries remained explosive. Other portions of the archive scattered through more violent means. When partisan raiders discovered Clara's apartment in Milan in April 1945, they found several volumes of her recent diaries. These men were not historians or preservationists. They were revolutionaries who recognized the potential value of documents from Mussolini's inner circle. Pages from these volumes began, appearing on black markets within months. Soviet agents, eager for any intelligence about Western dealings with fascist leaders, purchased an estimated 300 pages for $5,000 each. These documents disappeared into KGB archives, where many remain classified to this day. The American Central Intelligence Agency, through a convoluted operation spanning years, acquired their own collection of Clara's diary pages. In 1957, they conducted what intelligence agencies call a honeypot operation, using romantic entanglement to gain access to a target's information. Clara's nephew, who had inherited some of her documents, became involved with a woman who was, unknown to him, a CIA asset. Through this relationship, the agency obtained approximately 300 pages, covering crucial periods of 1943 and 1944. These pages provided American intelligence with insights into German military planning, Italian political negotiations, and the psychological state of Axis leadership during the war's turning point. The CIA's possession of these documents was not publicly acknowledged until declassification began in the late 1990s, and even then, significant portions remain redacted. The Vatican's role in preserving and concealing portions of Clara's archive remains among the most controversial aspects of this story. Vatican archivists hold an estimated 800 pages of her diaries, documents whose existence the Holy See has never officially confirmed. How did the Vatican acquire these pages? The most credible theory involves Clara's father, Francesco Petacci, who maintained his position as Vatican physician throughout the war and its aftermath. In the chaos of April 1945, as the regime collapsed and Clara fled north with Mussolini, Francesco may have secured some of his daughter's documents, delivering them to Vatican authorities for safekeeping. The Church's motivation for accepting and concealing these documents likely stems from what they contain. Detailed accounts of Vatican dealings with fascist authorities, financial arrangements, and political accommodations that the Church would prefer remain hidden. The Vatican's secret archive operates under rules that restrict access to documents until a century has passed from their creation. This means that the Clara Petacci documents held there, if they exist as suspected, will not become available to researchers until April 28, 2045, exactly 100 years after her death. This century-long seal ensures that everyone mentioned in her diaries, everyone who might be embarrassed or incriminated by her revelations, will have passed away before the truth emerges. It is a long game of historical concealment, one that the Vatican has played many times with many different collections of sensitive material. In 2009, a discovery in Rome reminded the world that Clara's archive was not yet exhausted, that new revelations might emerge at any moment. Construction workers renovating a bank building in the city's historic centre broke through a wall to find a forgotten safe deposit box. The box had been registered in 1945 under a false name, but research quickly established it belonged to Clara. Inside were documents from the final week of her life, entries dated from April 19th through April 27th, 1945. These were the last thoughts, observations, and secrets Clara committed to paper before her execution. The content of these final entries is staggering in its implications. Clara knew she was likely going to die. She wrote with the urgency of someone trying to leave a record, to ensure that certain truths survived even if she did not. She documented the final collapse of Mussolini's regime day by day, describing his mental deterioration, the desertion of his most loyal followers, the impossibility of any escape that would preserve both their lives and their dignity. She listed names of German officers who offered to help them flee, along with the bribes they demanded. She recorded conversations about suicide pacts, about the locations where they might make a final stand, about the various betrayals that were occurring hourly as the fascist structure disintegrated. Most significantly, these final diary entries contained specific information about hidden assets. Clara wrote down the account numbers for Swiss banks holding Mussolini's emergency funds. She listed the locations of gold reserves that had been moved out of Italy to secure locations in Switzerland and Argentina. She documented works of art that had been stolen from museums and private collections, noting where they had been hidden and who currently possessed them. This was not abstract information. These were precise details that, if authenticated and acted upon, could lead to the recovery of millions of dollars in assets and stolen property. The discovery of these final diary entries immediately triggered legal battles that continue to this day. Families whose property was confiscated by the fascist regime filed claims based on Clara's inventory. Swiss banks were sued for information about accounts Clara mentioned. Italian authorities demanded custody of the documents as state property. The family who owned the building where the safe deposit box was found claimed ownership rights to its contents. After years of litigation, the documents were ultimately placed under court seal, available only to approved researchers under strict supervision, with publication of their contents forbidden until legal questions are resolved. In practice, this means that the most explosive portions of Clara's final testimony remain inaccessible, their secrets preserved by legal rather than historical considerations. The technological examination of Clara's surviving documents has added layers of understanding that the original text alone could not provide. Multispectral imaging, a technique that uses multiple wavelengths of light to reveal writing that is invisible to the naked eye, was applied to diary pages that had been partially burned or water damaged. This process recovered text from dozens of pages that were previously considered illegible. Among the revelations were Clara's detailed records of Mussolini's medical treatments, a chronicle of pharmaceutical interventions that explained much about his erratic behavior in the war's final years. Clara documented methamphetamine injections that Mussolini received to maintain energy for his grueling schedule. These stimulant drugs, administered by his personal physician, produced the artificial vitality that allowed him to work 18-hour days despite his underlying poor health. But they also caused paranoid episodes, sudden rages, and impaired judgment. Clara noted the correlation between injection dates and Mussolini's most irrational decisions, a pattern that suggests the drugs were not simply maintaining his function, but actively undermining it. She recorded testosterone supplements he took to combat the symptoms of aging and disease, treatments that triggered violent mood swings. She described experimental sulfur drugs, early antibiotics used to treat his syphilis, medications that destroyed his liver function while failing to cure the underlying infection. DNA analysis of certain diary pages added another dimension of authentication and revelation. Bloodstains on several pages were tested and matched to Mussolini's genetic profile, confirmation obtained through comparison with samples from his verified remains. The presence of his blood on her diary pages corroborated Clara's accounts of suicide attempts that Mussolini made during periods of despair. She had written about finding him in his bathroom with slashed wrists, about talking him back from the edge, about hiding weapons and pills to prevent further attempts. The blood evidence proved these were not dramatic exaggerations, but literal truth. Linguistic analysis using computer algorithms revealed another layer of complexity in Clara's writing. Researchers scanning her love letters, seemingly innocent romantic correspondence, discovered patterns that suggested coded communication. Certain phrases appeared with unusual frequency and in contexts that seemed awkward if read purely as expressions of affection. Further analysis demonstrated that these passages actually conveyed military intelligence to Italian agents operating in neutral countries. Clara had been not merely a witness and recorder, but an active participant in espionage, using her romantic correspondence as a cover for transmitting sensitive information. The discovery transformed understanding of her role, from passive observer to active operative. Swiss investigators, pursuing leads from Clara's diaries about hidden assets, employed ground-penetrating radar at properties she had visited during trips to Switzerland. The technology detected anomalies consistent with underground storage facilities at 4 separate locations. These appeared to be bunkers or vaults constructed specifically to house documents or valuables. However, Swiss law protects property rights with extraordinary rigor, and the current owners of these properties have refused permission for excavation. Legal battles to gain access have been ongoing for years, with no resolution in sight. The possibility that additional caches of Clara's documents or related materials remain buried, protected by neutral Swiss territory and stringent property law, adds another element of incompleteness to the historical record. Each fragment of Clara's archive that surfaces creates ripples through historical scholarship. A single page can confirm or contradict established narratives, can open new avenues of research, can force reconsideration of events long considered understood. The incompleteness of the archive, the knowledge that substantial portions remain hidden, classified, or undiscovered, means that the history of World War II's Italian theatre remains provisional. We know there is more to know, evidence that exists but remains inaccessible, truths that Clara recorded but that have not yet reached historians. The diaries transform our understanding of how historical knowledge is created and controlled. They demonstrate that the most important witnesses are sometimes the most compromised, that the deepest truths often survive through accident rather than design, that nations will spend decades trying to control information that threatens their preferred narratives. Clara's 3-color ink system, her decision to distribute her archive across multiple hiding places, her final desperate act of documenting everything in those last days before execution. All of these choices were made by a woman who understood that knowledge is power and that power seeks to control knowledge. As we move forward in Clara's story, as we follow her desperate flight through a collapsing Italy and toward her final confrontation with mortality, remember that everything we know comes from these fragments, these survived pages that represent only a portion of what she recorded. The full story of Clara Petacci and Benito Mussolini remains partially hidden, locked in Vatican vaults, buried in Swiss soil, classified in intelligence archives, or lost forever to fire and time. We work with what survived, aware that absence shapes historical understanding as much as presence. There are moments when history accelerates, when years of accumulated tension release in hours of chaotic movement. April 25, 1945, was such a moment for Italy. The fascist regime, which had ruled for more than 2 decades, was collapsing not gradually but catastrophically, its structures disintegrating almost visibly as loyalties shifted and alliances shattered. At 4:17 that morning, a convoy of vehicles departed from Milan heading north toward the Swiss border. In one of those vehicles sat Clara Petacci, who had made a choice that still puzzles historians 8 decades later. Her family had arranged for her escape. A private plane waited at an airfield, fueled and ready to fly her to Switzerland, where safety and neutrality beckoned. She had the means, the connections, and the opportunity to save herself. Her family begged her to take this escape route, to abandon Mussolini to his fate and preserve her own life. She refused. Instead, she chose to join the convoy, to stay beside the man she loved as his world ended around them. It was a decision that sealed her fate, and it was made with full knowledge of the likely consequences. The Mercedes that carried Clara and Mussolini was not simply a vehicle of escape, but a mobile treasury. $3 million in gold bars, their weight carefully distributed to avoid overloading the suspension, lay packed in reinforced cases. Diamonds stolen from Yugoslav royalty, gems taken as spoils of war and political plunder, sparkled in velvet cases. And among these tangible riches were documents potentially more valuable than any precious metal or stone. Papers that revealed the names of Allied officers who had accepted Axis bribes, evidence of corruption at the highest levels of military command. Clara knew what the car carried because she had helped inventory it, had assisted in selecting which items were essential enough to transport during flight. She also possessed knowledge more valuable than anything physically present in the convoy. Clara knew about Operation Sunrise, a secret so closely held that even many high-ranking Axis officers remained unaware of it. This was the code name for negotiations occurring in Bern, Switzerland, where SS General Karl Wolff was offering to surrender all German forces in Italy without Adolf Hitler's knowledge or authorization. These negotiations represented a profound betrayal of the Nazi command structure, an acknowledgement by senior German officers that the war was lost and that survival required defecting from the dying regime. Clara had the radio frequencies necessary to contact American agents facilitating these negotiations. She had memorized the code words that would identify her as someone authorized to discuss surrender terms. She possessed the precise geographical coordinates for a Swiss border crossing where neutral guards had been bribed to provide safe passage and false identity documents. In other words, Clara carried in her mind everything necessary for her and Mussolini to escape, to cut a deal, to survive. The question that haunts this story is why she did not use this knowledge, why they did not attempt to leverage what they knew into survival. The answer appears to involve Mussolini's psychology more than Clara's. His pride, his inability to conceive of himself as a supplicant begging for mercy, prevented him from pursuing the complots, very options that his companion had carefully preserved. Clara could show him the path to survival, but she could not force him to walk it. The convoy's composition tells us much about the regime's final state. 23 vehicles departed Milan that morning, a caravan that represented the last mobile fragment of fascist authority. German military escorts provided initial protection, but these were not elite SS units loyal unto death. These were exhausted soldiers from regular Wehrmacht units, men who had fought for years and who now saw clearly that Germany was defeated. Their commitment to protecting Mussolini extended only as far as their own safety required. At Como, when the strategic situation made further escort dangerous to themselves, the German soldiers simply departed, and in departing, they helped themselves to 2 trucks filled with gold. It was not violent robbery, but casual theft, soldiers taking payment they felt they had earned before disappearing into the chaos of war's end. Clara witnessed these betrayals from inside the convoy, watched as the protective structure around them dissolved. She saw Mussolini's own ministers, men who had built careers on fascist patronage, fleeing with suitcases packed with cash. These were not emergency evacuations with minimal personal belongings. These were calculated thefts, officials loading vehicles with as much wealth as they could carry before abandoning their leader. They departed with maps marking partisan positions, intelligence that might be traded for safe passage or sold to the highest bidder. Each departure reduced the convoy's size and increased the vulnerability of those who remained. The 3-day flight became a catalogue of systemic failure, a demonstration of how quickly organized authority can dissolve when fear overrides loyalty. At every checkpoint, Clara observed the transformation of Italian society in real time. Soldiers who had once saluted Mussolini now demanded bribes to allow convoy passage. The salutes, when they came at all, were perfunctory gestures made before hands extended for payment. Villagers who had once gathered to cheer now threw stones, not in organized resistance but in spontaneous expressions of rage at the regime that had brought destruction to their country. The speed of this transformation, from adulation to hostility, revealed how much of fascism's popular support had been performance rather than genuine allegiance. Clara kept a pocket notebook during these 72 hours, a smaller and more portable record than her formal diaries. This notebook survived the final chaos and has been preserved as a crucial primary source. In it, she recorded license plate numbers of vehicles that left the convoy, creating a roster of desertion that historians have used to track the regime's final days. She noted names of German officers who switched sides, men who went from protecting the convoy to joining with partisan forces or simply disappearing into civilian life. She drew a diagram of the convoy's final formation when partisan forces surrounded them at Dongo, a simple sketch that shows the positions of remaining vehicles and the approximately 200 partisans who blocked their path. The encounter at Dongo, a small town on Lake Como's western shore, occurred on the afternoon of April 27, 1945. The convoy had been attempting to reach Chiavenna, a border town where crossing into Switzerland might still be possible. But partisan intelligence had tracked their movement and local resistance forces established a roadblock that the diminished convoy could not fight through or circumvent. The partisans were communist forces, loyal not to any restored Italian government but to their own political vision of post-fascist Italy. Their commander at Dongo, Count Pier Luigi Bellini delle Stelle, whose aristocratic title sat oddly with his communist politics, faced a decision about what to do with the most wanted man in Italy. Clara's notebook from this period reveals something crucial about their situation. They had options. The convoy still carried enough Swiss francs to offer substantial bribes. Switzerland was less than 30 kilometers away, a short journey if passage could be negotiated. Some partisan units, particularly those less ideologically rigid, had been accepting payment to allow fascist officials to escape. The precedent existed. The money existed. The knowledge of how to make such arrangements existed in Clara's mind and could have been deployed. But Mussolini's pride prevented negotiation. According to accounts from survivors of the convoy, he refused to consider bribery as beneath his dignity. He seemed to believe, even at this late moment, that his identity and authority carried weight, that he could command rather than plead. This miscalculation was fatal. The partisans were not impressed by his rank or history. To them, he represented the enemy they had been, fighting for years, and his capture was a victory to be preserved, not a commodity to be sold. During the hours at the Dongo checkpoint, as negotiations occurred between partisan commanders about what to do with the captured convoy, Clara had time to reflect on the path that had led to this moment. She could see, with terrible clarity, the series of choices that had brought them here. The decision to flee north rather than south toward Allied lines, the refusal to use the Swiss contact information she possessed, the pride that prevented negotiation when negotiation might have saved them. Each choice had narrowed their options, had closed doors that might have remained open, and now they sat in a town by a lake, surrounded by armed men who viewed them not as people to be protected but as prizes to be claimed. The documents Clara carried in her purse during these final hours contained information that multiple governments would have paid fortunes to obtain or destroy. She had not left these papers behind when fleeing Milan, but had kept them on her person, aware of their value, and perhaps hoping they might serve as bargaining chips if circumstances became desperate. These documents included evidence of Allied commanders slowing their advance deliberately, allowing German units to escape with stolen art in exchange for commission payments. The sophistication of this corruption, involving coordination between supposedly enemy forces, represented a profound betrayal of the war's official narrative. Clara possessed names, dates, locations, and amounts, a complete evidentiary package that would have caused international scandal if publicly revealed. She also carried evidence of Vatican financial dealings with the fascist regime, documentation of how religious institutions had laundered money for political purposes. These records threatened not just individual reputations but institutional credibility, the carefully maintained image of the Catholic Church as existing, above and apart from fascist politics. The Vatican's extensive efforts to recover and suppress Clara's documents in subsequent years stemmed largely from fear of what these specific papers might reveal. As night fell on April 27th, Clara and Mussolini were separated from the remaining convoy members and moved to a waterfront customs house in Dongo. This isolation was not for their protection but for control, ensuring they could not escape or communicate with potential rescuers. Through the customs house windows, Clara could see Lake Como's dark waters, beautiful and indifferent to human drama. She had travelled from Rome, from privilege and power, to this small building by a lake, where her life would be measured in hours rather than years. The journey through collapsing Italy had taken 3 days, covering fewer than 200 kilometres. This was not distance but density, every kilometre packed with betrayals, revelations, and narrowing options. Clara had witnessed the complete decomposition of a political system, watched authority dissolve into opportunism and fear. She had seen loyalty transform into abandonment, had observed how quickly the structures that maintain order can collapse when the centre fails to hold. And she had made her own choices throughout this journey, particularly the choice to remain present, to stay beside Mussolini, despite every opportunity to pursue her own survival. Understanding why she made this choice requires grappling with the psychology of profound attachment, with love that persists despite reason and self-interest. Clara was not naive about Mussolini's nature or their situation. Her diaries and notebook demonstrate clear-eyed understanding of their circumstances. She knew they were likely going to die. She knew that the information she possessed might save her if traded to the right parties. She knew that her family had provided escape routes she was choosing not to take, and yet she remained, bound by emotional ties that were stronger than survival instinct. The 3-day flight represents compression, history accelerating to such speed that events blur together. For Clara, each hour brought fresh evidence that the world she had known was ending, that the regime which had provided her identity and purpose was not just failing but erasing itself. The gold being stolen, the ministers fleeing, the soldiers demanding bribes, all of this was not just collapse but active dissolution, participants taking what they could before the structure completely disintegrated. She was watching the end in real time, moment by moment, checkpoint by checkpoint, betrayal by betrayal. As Clara sat in the customs house in Dongo on that final night, she faced the reality that her choices had brought her to a place with no remaining options. The information in her mind, the documents in her purse, the knowledge that might have purchased safety, all of it now seemed destined to die with her. She had accompanied Mussolini through the last 3 days of mobility, and now they had arrived at stasis, at a place where flight was no longer possible and where only final confrontations remained. The customs house at Dongo, where Clara Petacci spent her final night alive, was a modest building, functional rather than elegant, designed for processing trade goods crossing the Swiss border in more ordinary times. Now it served as a prison for history's most valuable witnesses. Clara spent 18 hours in that building, 18 hours during which she possessed knowledge that could have rewritten political realities, could have saved her life, could have altered the post-war order that was even then being constructed. She chose to reveal nothing, a choice that has generated decades of speculation about her motives, her psychology, and the full extent of what she knew. The partisan commander Pedro, whose full name was Pier Luigi Bellini della Stella, conducted the interrogation personally. He understood, at least partially, the significance of his prisoners. Mussolini obviously represented a tremendous political and symbolic capture, but Clara's value was less obvious and potentially greater. Pedro had intelligence suggesting she maintained records, that she knew details about fascist operations, that she might possess information useful to the emerging post-war Italian government. His approach to interrogation mixed threat and promise. He made clear that Clara would almost certainly be executed alongside Mussolini. But he also suggested that cooperation might lead to different outcomes, that information could be traded for life. Clara's response to these overtures was consistent and absolute refusal. She would not discuss what she knew about German operations in Italy. She would not reveal the locations of hidden fascist assets. She would not name collaborators who might still be in positions to be prosecuted. Her silence was not passive but active, a deliberate withholding that Pedro found both frustrating and, one suspects, somewhat impressive. He was not torturing her, not using physical coercion beyond the implicit threat of execution. This was psychological pressure, an attempt to make her choose survival over loyalty. And Clara chose loyalty, or chose silence, or chose something more complex that involved both. What exactly was Clara protecting through her silence? The question has multiple answers, layers of motivation that probably intertwined in her own mind. At the most obvious level, she was protecting Mussolini's legacy and the people who had served him. The information she possessed about British intelligence officers who had secretly aided Mussolini's rise in the 1920s represented profound embarrassment for Britain if revealed. These were not minor officials, but figures whose careers had flourished in subsequent decades, who now held positions of authority in post-war reconstruction. Their early support for fascism, their belief that Mussolini represented a useful counterweight to communism, their willingness to provide intelligence and strategic advice to his regime, all of this would have destroyed reputations and undermined confidence in British institutions. Similarly, Clara knew about Vatican officials who had laundered fascist money through religious charities, who had provided banking services for the regime, who had maintained channels of communication even as the Church officially proclaimed neutrality. The Vatican's relationship with fascism was complex, involving opposition to certain policies but cooperation with others, and Clara had observed and documented the practical reality behind public positions. Revealing these details would have damaged the Church's moral authority at precisely the moment when Catholic institutions were positioning themselves as guides for moral reconstruction in post-war Europe. The American businessmen whose companies continued trading with Italy throughout the war represented another category of secrets Clara guarded. These were not small operators, but executives of major corporations, individuals whose decisions to maintain commercial relationships with fascist Italy violated both official policy and public sentiment. Clara knew names, knew specific transactions, knew which materials had been sold and which payments had been made. This information threatened not just individual reputations but suggested systematic corruption in American business practices during wartime. Beyond protecting individuals and institutions, Clara possessed technical secrets that had military and strategic value even as the war in Europe ended. Through her brother Marcello's involvement in weapons deals, she had learned about German uranium shipments hidden in northern Italian mines. The atomic age was just beginning. The bombs that would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were weeks away from deployment, and knowledge about uranium sources was intensely valuable to multiple governments. Clara knew the locations of these hidden shipments, knew which mines contained sealed chambers where radioactive materials had been stored, knew the quantities involved and the intended purposes. This information was worth killing for, worth dying for, worth keeping secret. She also knew about prototype jet fighters buried in alpine tunnels, aircraft that represented the cutting edge of aviation technology. These were not production models, but experimental designs, some of which incorporated innovations that would influence post-war aircraft development. The locations where these prototypes had been hidden, buried to prevent Allied capture as German forces retreated, represented treasure troves for engineers and intelligence services. Clara had been told these locations by German officers who believed she and Mussolini might need bargaining chips for negotiating asylum. She memorized this information rather than recording it in writing, understanding its sensitivity. Perhaps most dangerously, Clara possessed formulas for synthetic fuel that German chemists had developed. With natural oil resources increasingly scarce in Axis-controlled territory, synthetic fuel production had become crucial to military operations. The formulas Clara had seen represented years of research and experimentation, knowledge that could have extended German resistance if more widely deployed. In post-war context, this information had civilian applications, promised industrial advantages to whichever nation possessed it. Clara's knowledge of these formulas, her ability to reproduce them from memory, made her a target for intelligence services and a threat to anyone wanting to control post-war chemical industries. The strategic information Clara carried included Mussolini's detailed plan to flood the Po Valley, creating a water barrier against Allied advance. This was not a casual idea, but an engineered proposal, complete with calculations, about which dikes and levees needed to be destroyed, how much of northern Italy's agricultural heartland would be inundated, and how long such flooding would delay advancing armies. The plan had not been implemented, largely because Italian engineers and military commanders refused to participate in such comprehensive destruction of their own country. But the engineering studies existed, the calculations had been made, and Clara knew where these documents were stored. In post-war reconstruction, this information could help prevent future disasters, or more cynically, could be used to threaten new flooding for political purposes. She knew the triggering mechanisms for explosives planted beneath Milan's infrastructure. As Allied forces approached major Italian cities, German engineers had prepared extensive demolitions designed to deny enemies the use of industrial facilities, transportation networks, and government buildings. These explosives were installed with sophisticated triggering systems, some on timers, some requiring remote activation, some designed to detonate if tampered with. Clara had been briefed on these systems, had been shown diagrams so she could understand the scale of potential destruction. Her knowledge included which buildings were rigged, how the systems worked, and crucially, how they could be safely disarmed. This information could save thousands of lives if Allied forces needed to clear cities of booby traps. Most politically explosive among Clara's secrets was proof that certain Allied commanders had deliberately slowed their advance through Italy, allowing German units to escape with stolen art worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This was not speculation or rumor, but documented conspiracy, coordination between supposedly enemy forces that prioritized theft over military objectives. Clara possessed evidence of communications between these commanders and German officers, knew the mechanisms by which art was moved from Italy to Switzerland and beyond, knew the percentage commissions that Allied officers received for their cooperation. The scale of this corruption involved dozens of officers, hundreds of artworks, and betrayal of the very cause these men were supposedly fighting for. The art theft revealed by Clara's knowledge was not opportunistic looting but systematic plunder with high-level coordination. German forces had created detailed inventories of Italian art collections, identifying the most valuable pieces and preparing them for transport. As Allied forces advanced, certain German units were allowed to move artworks to Swiss storage facilities, while military equipment and personnel were abandoned. The coordination required for this arrangement involved Allied intelligence officers providing information about advancing troop movements, deliberate delays in pursuing retreating German units, and active misdirection of Allied forces away from transport routes. Clara knew which officers participated, what they received in payment, and where some of the stolen art ultimately ended up. Understanding why Clara chose silence, despite possessing information that could have saved her, requires grappling with several possible motivations. The most romantic interpretation suggests absolute loyalty to Mussolini, a willingness to die rather than betray him or his interests even after death. This explanation has appeal in its simplicity and its alignment with Clara's documented devotion. She loved him, therefore she protected him and his legacy, accepting death as the price of loyalty. There is almost certainly truth in this interpretation, though it cannot be the complete explanation. A more complex interpretation suggests Clara recognized that revealing what she knew would not actually save her. The partisan forces holding her were communist revolutionaries, whose ideology demanded her execution as a symbol of fascist decadence. Offering them information might not change their determination to make her death part of their political theater. Moreover, revealing secrets to partisans would make her a target for everyone those secrets threatened. British intelligence, American military, Vatican officials, corrupt Allied commanders, all would have reason to ensure she never publicly testified to what she knew. Trading secrets for temporary safety might just expand the number of parties who wanted her dead. There is also the possibility that Clara was protecting herself in death. She came from a Catholic family, believed in an afterlife where she would be judged. Perhaps she calculated that dying with secrets intact was morally preferable to betraying confidences, even if those confidences involved evil people and evil acts. This explanation requires understanding how people compartmentalize morality, how someone can love evil without believing themselves complicit, how loyalty can be maintained even to unworthy recipients. Clara may have constructed a moral framework where silence equaled integrity, where keeping secrets proved her character even if the secrets themselves documented horrors. Another interpretation suggests simple exhaustion and acceptance. After 13 years of living at the center of fascism's machinery, after witnessing atrocities and participating in deceptions, after carrying the weight of knowledge about crimes and collaborations, perhaps Clara simply wanted it to end. The silence was not strategic or noble, but tired, a refusal to continue playing games of information and manipulation. She had spent years as a keeper of secrets, years managing knowledge and calculating its use. In her final hours, perhaps she chose to stop calculating, to let death come without making final transactions. The 18 hours in the customs house at Dongo gave Clara time to contemplate what would happen to the information she possessed if she died without revealing it. Some would die with her, knowledge that existed only in her memory. Some would survive in her diaries, scattered and hidden but potentially recoverable. Some would persist in other witnesses, in documents she had not created, in evidence that existed independently of her testimony. She could not control all of this, could not determine how history would remember her or what truths would eventually surface. But she could control her final actions, could choose silence or revelation, could decide whether to trade what she knew for a possibility of survival. The tragedy of Clara's final hours is that she possessed information that could have served justice if properly revealed. War crimes investigations were beginning, efforts to document fascist atrocities and hold perpetrators accountable. Clara knew about specific crimes, knew who gave orders and who carried them out, knew about massacres and murders that might otherwise go unpunished. Her silence protected guilty parties, allowed them to escape accountability, enabled them to build post-war careers without facing consequences for wartime actions. Whatever her motivations for remaining silent, the result was that justice was denied to victims of the regime she had served. Yet we must also acknowledge that Clara's position was impossible. She was not a neutral historian but a participant, not an objective witness but someone deeply compromised by her relationship with Mussolini. Any testimony she provided would be contested, her credibility attacked, her motivations questioned. She would be portrayed as a scorned lover, seeking revenge, or a desperate woman inventing stories to save herself. The information she possessed, no matter how accurate, would be filtered through perceptions of who she was and what she represented. Perhaps she understood this, understood that her testimony would be tainted by her identity, and chose silence as the only form of dignity available to her. As dawn approached on April 28, 1945, Clara Petacci sat in the customs house, knowing that revelation or silence, she was unlikely to survive. The secrets she carried would die with her, or survive in forms she could not control. She had reached the end of choices, the point where agency narrows to acceptance. The woman who had sought power through proximity to it, who had accumulated knowledge that could topple governments, who had witnessed evil and documented atrocity, now faced the final simplicity of mortality. What she knew, what she chose to protect, why she refused every offer to trade information for survival. These questions remain as fascinating and frustrating 8 decades later as they were in that customs house as night turned to dawn. The mechanics of state execution, even in revolutionary chaos, follow certain patterns. Orders flow from authority, executioners are designated, and the condemned are moved to locations where the act can be accomplished. On April 28, 1945, at 3:20 in the afternoon, these patterns converged. On a villa called Casa Belmonte near the village of Giulino di Mezzegra, Walter Audicio, a communist partisan whose nom de guerre was Colonel Valerio, arrived with explicit instructions from Milan. The National Liberation Committee, the political body coordinating partisan resistance in northern Italy, had decided that Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci must die immediately, before any Allied forces could intervene, before any legal proceedings could complicate the political narrative, before any rescue attempts could deny the partisans their symbolic victory. Clara knew Audicio was coming before she saw him. The atmosphere in the customs house had changed as messengers arrived and departed, as partisan guards became more tense, as the routines of imprisonment shifted toward something final. She had time to prepare herself, though what preparation means when facing execution within hours is difficult to comprehend. She wore Mussolini's coat, having been given it against the cold of the waterfront building. Beneath her clothing, hidden against her skin, she had placed her final diary pages, a last attempt to ensure her words survived even if she did not. In her pocket she carried a cyanide capsule, obtained through sources never fully explained, a final option if she chose to control the manner of her death. The journey from Dongo to Giulino di Mezzegra covered approximately 2 kilometers along Lake Como's western shore. Clara and Mussolini were transported separately, isolated from each other and from any remaining members of their party. This separation prevented communication, prevented any coordination of final statements or actions, ensured that each would face death alone, even if in proximity. The route took them through countryside of extraordinary beauty, mountains rising dramatically from the lake's edge, spring flowers blooming indifferent to human drama. It was the kind of landscape that invites contemplation of eternity, of perspectives beyond, immediate mortality. Whether Clara noticed this beauty, whether she had any mental space for aesthetic observation in her final minutes, we cannot know. Casa Belmonte, the villa chosen as execution site, was not a grand building but a modest residence set back from the main road. Its selection appears to have been practical rather than symbolic, a location close to Dongo but private enough that the act could be accomplished without immediate public witness. The villa's gates opened to a courtyard, and it was in this courtyard, against a stone wall, that Clara Petacci and Benito Mussolini would face their executioners. The ordinariness of the location contrasts with the historical significance of what occurred there, a reminder that the most consequential moments often happen in unremarkable places. Witness accounts of Clara's final minutes vary significantly, a function of chaos, selective memory, and political motivations for shaping the narrative. What appears consistent across testimonies is that Clara spoke before the shooting began, that she made some kind of statement or plea. According to Ardicio's account, written years later with obvious political purpose, Clara begged for her life and offered to tell secrets. He claimed she offered information about gold reserves, about hidden assets, about Allied officers who had collaborated with fascists. His account portrays her as cowardly, breaking under pressure, willing to betray anyone to survive. This narrative served partisan purposes, reducing Clara from complicated figure to simple caricature of fascist decadence. Other witnesses provided different accounts. A partisan guard claimed Clara maintained dignity, that she spoke not about secrets but about love, that her final words concerned her devotion to Mussolini rather than negotiations for survival. This account portrays her as romantic martyr, dying for love rather than politics, a figure of tragic nobility rather than desperation. Like Audizio's version, this account serves narrative purposes, creating a story that fits particular interpretations of who Clara was and what her death meant. A third account, from a local resident who observed from a distance, suggested Clara spoke for approximately 4 minutes, that she was neither begging nor proclaiming, but explaining something at length. This witness could not hear the words, but described Clara's body language as engaged rather than terrified, as though she was making points rather than pleading. This account raises the possibility that Clara used her final moments to deliver testimony, to speak facts into the record, even if no one was officially recording, to ensure that someone heard her full truth before death silenced her permanently. The most intriguing account comes from Michele Moretti, the partisan who drove the truck transporting the bodies after execution. Years later, in an interview given when he was an old man with no apparent political motivation for dishonesty, Moretti claimed Clara's final words were, "The Swiss know everything." This statement, if accurate, suggests she was not pleading or testifying but delivering a warning or revealing a crucial fact. If Swiss authorities had been given information by Clara or her representatives, if they possessed documents or testimony that could verify or expand on her secrets, then her death would not achieve the silence her executioners presumably desired. The phrase, "the Swiss know everything," has launched decades of investigation, efforts to find what information Clara might have deposited with Swiss banks or authorities, attempts to recover testimony she might have provided before her final journey north. The execution itself was mechanically troubled, a detail that has generated speculation about whether technical failure or human hesitation caused the problems. Audicio's weapon, a machine pistol, jammed when he first attempted to fire. He cleared the jam and tried again. The weapon jammed a second time. According to some accounts, he tried a third time before the weapon finally fired. This repeated jamming seems improbable as pure mechanical failure. Machine pistols of the type Audicio carried were generally reliable, and multiple consecutive jams suggest either severe mechanical problems or operator error, possibly caused by stress or hesitation. Some historians have interpreted the jamming as subconscious reluctance, Audicio's hand not quite steady, his manipulation of the weapon not quite decisive, his body resisting what his ideology demanded. When the weapon finally fired, Clara was shot 7 times. The number of bullet wounds and their locations have been documented from photographs and autopsy reports. What those reports also reveal is that the bullets came from two different weapons, not just the machine pistol Audicio carried. This indicates that at least one other partisan fired, either assisting in the execution or taking independent action. The identity of the second shooter has never been definitively established, one of many details about this event that remain uncertain or contested. The forensic evidence tells additional stories that complicate official narratives. Clara's body showed defensive wounds on her hands and arms, injuries consistent with raising her arms to protect herself or physically struggling with her captors. These wounds suggest she did not stand passively accepting death but fought, at least briefly, against what was happening. The autopsy photographs show bruising and cuts that could not have been caused by bullets, evidence of physical confrontation before the shooting. Whether this struggle occurred immediately before execution or during earlier interactions with partisans cannot be determined from the physical evidence alone. Clara's purse, which multiple witnesses testified she carried to the execution site, was missing when her body arrived in Milan. That purse had been described as containing explosive documents, papers that partisans who searched her at capture found significant enough to mention specifically. What happened to those documents remains unknown. They might have been seized by Audicio, taken as trophies by other partisans, or deliberately destroyed to prevent their contents from becoming public. The disappearance of Clara's purse and its contents represents loss of primary source material that might have answered many questions about what she knew and what she chose to carry in her final hours. Similarly, Mussolini's briefcase, which he had handcuffed to his wrist when captured at Dongo, was missing when bodies arrived at Piazzale Loreto in Milan. That briefcase was reported to contain crucial documents, possibly including evidence of Swiss bank accounts, contact information for fascist networks, and other materials Mussolini wanted to keep physically secured to his person. The handcuffs had been cut or removed, the briefcase taken by someone between execution and public display. Like Clara's purse, this briefcase has never been recovered, its contents unknown, representing another gap in the documentary record of fascism's final hours. American intelligence officers photographed the execution scene within hours of the killings, before bodies were transported to Milan. These photographs, some of which remain classified, documented blood spatter patterns that forensic analysts have since examined. The patterns suggested that bodies had been moved and rearranged before the famous public photographs were taken, that the positions in which corpses appeared at Piazzale Loreto did not match the positions in which they died. This rearrangement was likely for photographic purposes, positioning bodies for maximum visual impact when displayed to crowds and cameras. But the fact of rearrangement creates uncertainty about other details, raises questions about what else might have been altered or staged. Temperature readings taken from the corpses when they arrived in Milan indicated they died at different times, not simultaneously, as official accounts claimed. The temperature differential suggested several hours between deaths, meaning Clara and Mussolini did not die in the same execution event. This evidence has generated theories that they were killed separately, possibly interrogated individually before death, that the execution site might have been different for each. The official narrative of simultaneous execution against the villa wall may have been constructed for symbolic purposes, creating the image of lovers dying together when the reality was more fragmented and less romantically coherent. The disposal of Clara's final diary pages, hidden beneath her clothing, remains mysterious. Did Audicio or other partisans find these pages when they handled her body? Were the pages destroyed as compromising evidence, or kept by someone who recognized their value? Have they been sold to collectors or intelligence services? Or do they remain in private hands, waiting for some future emergence? The diary pages Clara prepared for her death, the final testimony she chose to carry on her body, might still exist somewhere, might still contain revelations about her knowledge and her perspective on events. Or they might have been burned immediately, deemed too dangerous to preserve, their contents lost except in the memories of whoever briefly read them. What we can know with certainty is that Clara Petacci died at approximately 4 o'clock on April 28, 1945, at age 33, in a villa courtyard near a small Italian village, killed by communist partisans as an example and a symbol. She died wearing her lover's coat, carrying poison she chose not to take, having spoken final words that different witnesses remembered differently. She died with secrets that could have changed historical understanding, with knowledge that might have altered political outcomes, with testimony that could have served justice or revenge depending on how it was used, and she died having chosen, repeatedly and definitively, not to trade what she knew for any chance at survival. The execution at Giuliano di Mezzegra was not the end of Clara's story, but a transition, a point where life ended but historical significance continued. Her body would be publicly displayed, photographed, desecrated by crowds. Her reputation would be debated, her character assessed, her choices analyzed. Her secrets would surface slowly through the decades, fragment by fragment, revelation by revelation. But in that courtyard, in those final minutes, none of this future existed for her. There was only the wall, the weapons, the final opportunity to speak or stay silent, and then the absolute conclusion that comes to all witnesses eventually, rendering their testimony complete. History does not end with death. The documentary record continues to evolve, evidence surfaces decades after events, and understanding transforms as new sources become available. In the case of Clara Petacci, death at age 33 in 1945 marked only the beginning of her document's journey through time. Every decade since has brought new revelations, each discovery forcing reconsideration of what we thought we knew, each fragment adding complexity to narratives that seemed complete. The story of what survived Clara's execution and how those survivals resurfaced is itself a remarkable tale of accident, determination, and the simple fact that secrets have extraordinary persistence. Consider 1964, 19 years after Clara's death. A construction crew in Rome, demolishing a building to make way for modern development, discovered something unexpected within a sealed drainage pipe. The pipe had been closed off during construction decades earlier, and there was no reason to expect it contained anything but accumulated debris. But when workers cut into the pipe, they found 40 pages of paper, carefully rolled and protected by the pipe's sealed environment. These pages were instantly recognizable as portions of Clara's diary, her distinctive handwriting and her tricolour ink system immediately apparent. The content of these 40 pages was explosive. Clara had documented Mussolini's 1944 plan to flee Italy entirely, to escape not just to Switzerland but to Japan via submarine. This was not fantasy or desperate rambling but detailed operational planning. She recorded conversations with German naval officers about submarine availability, discussions about routes across the Mediterranean and through Allied-controlled waters, negotiations about what Mussolini would bring with him and what he would leave behind. Most remarkably, she documented Emperor Hirohito's personal guarantee of asylum, a commitment from the Japanese throne to provide refuge for Italy's defeated dictator. This plan was never executed, obviously, but its very existence reveals dimensions of desperation and international coordination that historians had not previously understood. It demonstrates that Axis powers, even as they publicly proclaimed determination to fight to the end, were privately constructing escape routes for their leaders. It shows that Japan, itself facing inevitable defeat, was still willing to accept political liabilities like Mussolini as guests. And it confirms that Clara was not merely present during these discussions but was documenting them with precision, creating records that would eventually illuminate events she did not expect to survive. The discovery of these 40 pages in a drainage pipe raised immediate questions about how they arrived there. Who placed them in this unlikely hiding spot? When did this occur? Were there other similar caches waiting to be discovered? The most plausible theory suggests that someone from Clara's family or circle, someone with access to portions of her diaries after her death, deliberately hid these pages in a location that would survive fire and flood. The sealed drainage pipe was, from a preservationist perspective, nearly perfect. It was dry, dark, sealed against air and moisture, and unlikely to be disturbed for decades. Whoever chose this hiding place understood both the value of the documents and the necessity of protecting them from immediate discovery. 23 years later, in 1987, came what historians call the Venice discovery. A gondola workshop in Venice, a building that had been continuously occupied and operating for over a century, was undergoing renovation when workers found a waterproof container sealed within the wall structure. The container appeared to have been placed there during or shortly after World War II, though exact dating proved impossible. Inside were pages from Clara's diaries, covering a different period and different content than the Rome discovery. These Venice pages focused on Nazi gold shipments through Italian ports, a systematic plunder operation that Clara had observed and documented with remarkable detail. Each entry listed the weight of gold being transported, the ship carrying it, the destination port, and the bribes paid to Italian customs officials to ensure uninterrupted passage. This was not small-scale theft, but industrial-scale looting, gold stolen from national banks, private collections, and Jewish families, moved through Italy on its way to Swiss storage or other secure locations. Clara's records provided evidence of corruption at every level, naming customs officials, port authorities, and Italian military officers who participated in facilitating these shipments. The Venice discovery transformed historical understanding of how Nazi plunder networks operated. Scholars had known that gold moved through Italy, but Clara's documentation revealed the scale and sophistication of these operations. More significantly, her records could be cross-referenced with other evidence, confirming shipments that had been suspected but not proven, identifying participants whose involvement had been concealed, tracing movements of wealth that would later fuel post-war investigations and restitution claims. The impact of these discovered pages extended into legal proceedings, as families attempting to recover assets stolen during the war could now cite Clara's contemporary documentation as evidence. The 2003 Iraq invasion produced an unlikely connection to Clara's archive. When American forces secured Saddam Hussein's palaces, they discovered extensive libraries containing materials looted from various sources over decades. Among these materials were letters between Mussolini and Arab nationalist leaders, correspondence that had been translated and annotated in Clara's distinctive handwriting. These letters revealed promised weapons shipments from Italy to anti-British forces in the Middle East, part of Axis efforts to destabilize British colonial holdings by supporting indigenous resistance movements. That Clara had access to this correspondence, that she translated and annotated these documents, indicates her role extended beyond passive observation. She was processing information, adding context, perhaps preparing summaries for Mussolini to review. The documents revealed Clara as an active participant in the regime's information management, someone entrusted with sensitive diplomatic correspondence and expected to make it usable for decision-making. The fact that these particular documents ended up in Iraq, presumably transferred there by fascist officials who fled to the Middle East after the war, demonstrates how widely Clara's work dispersed through the chaos of regime collapse. Modern technology has enabled recovery of information from documents previously considered too damaged to read. Multispectral imaging, a technique using multiple wavelengths of light to reveal writing invisible to human eyes, has been applied to Clara's diary pages that suffered fire or water damage. This process has recovered text from dozens of pages, revealing content that survived physically but had been rendered illegible by environmental damage. Among the most significant recoveries were Clara's detailed medical records of Mussolini's treatments, documentation that explains much about his erratic behavior in the war's final years. These recovered medical records describe a pharmaceutical regimen that was, by any standard, dangerous and destabilizing. Clara documented methamphetamine injections that Mussolini received multiple times weekly, stimulants that provided artificial energy, but also caused paranoid episodes and impaired judgment. She recorded dates of these injections and then noted, sometimes days later, irrational decisions or violent outbursts that followed predictable patterns. The correlation between chemical intervention and behavioral consequence is clear in her documentation, suggesting she understood that Mussolini's leadership was being chemically distorted. She documented testosterone supplements prescribed to combat aging and disease, treatments that triggered violent mood swings and aggressive behavior. She described experimental sulfur drugs used to treat his syphilis, medications that destroyed his liver function without curing the underlying infection. The complete picture that emerges from these recovered medical records is of a man whose body and mind were failing, whose apparent vitality was pharmaceutical illusion, whose capacity for rational leadership had been progressively undermined by the very treatments meant to sustain him. Clara observed and recorded this deterioration with clinical precision, creating a medical history that explains political decisions previously attributed solely to strategic miscalculation. DNA analysis added another dimension of verification to Clara's documents. Bloodstains on several diary pages were tested using modern forensic techniques and matched to Mussolini's genetic profile, confirmation obtained through comparison with samples from his verified remains. These bloodstains corroborated Clara's accounts of Mussolini's suicide attempts, episodes she described in her diaries, but which had been dismissed by some historians as dramatic exaggeration. The blood evidence proved these were not inventions but literal truth, moments when Mussolini's despair overwhelmed his public persona, and Clara intervened to prevent his death. The presence of blood on diary pages also tells us about the immediate circumstances of Clara's documentation. She was not recording these events hours or days later from memory, but writing contemporaneously, perhaps even while blood was still wet. This suggests compulsive documentation, an urgency to record that overcame any shock or emotional response she might have felt. The psychological portrait that emerges is of someone for whom recording was reflexive, who turned to her diary as both witness and therapy, whose understanding of her own role involved creating a permanent record regardless of circumstances. Linguistic analysis, using artificial intelligence algorithms, revealed patterns in Clara's love letters that suggested coded communication. Researchers scanning hundreds of her letters, correspondence that appeared to be purely romantic, discovered unusual phrase repetitions and syntactic structures that seemed awkward if read as simple expressions of affection. Further analysis demonstrated these passages actually conveyed military intelligence to Italian agents operating in neutral countries. Clara had been using her romantic correspondence as a cover for transmitting sensitive information, embedding intelligence within love letters, in ways that would appear innocent to casual observation, but could be decoded by intended recipients. This discovery transformed understanding of Clara's role from passive observer to active operative. She was not merely recording what she witnessed, but actively participating in intelligence operations, using her position and her correspondence to move information to Italian agents abroad. The sophistication of this coding, the discipline required to maintain it across hundreds of letters while also maintaining believable romantic content, suggests training or natural aptitude for intelligence work that historians had not previously attributed to her. The question of who recruited her for this role, who taught her these techniques, whether she volunteered or was directed, remains unanswered and may never be definitively resolved. Swiss investigators, pursuing leads from Clara's diaries about hidden assets, employed ground-penetrating radar at properties she had visited during trips to Switzerland before the war's end. The technology detected anomalies at 4 separate locations, underground structures consistent with bunkers or vaults designed for document or valuables storage. These facilities appeared to have been constructed specifically for concealment, placed beneath legitimate buildings or properties in ways that would avoid casual detection. However, Swiss property law protects owners with extraordinary rigor, and the current owners of these properties have refused permission for excavation or more invasive investigation. The legal battles to gain access to these potential document caches have been ongoing for years without resolution. Swiss courts balance competing interests: the historical value of potentially recovering Clara's documents against property rights and national tradition of protecting privacy. The investigative teams argue that evidence of war crimes and stolen property might be contained in these underground facilities, that justice requires access. Property owners argue that speculation about what might be hidden does not justify violating their rights, that investigators should provide more definitive proof before intrusive searches are permitted. The standoff continues, with ground-penetrating radar showing something is there but legal protections preventing confirmation of exactly what that something is. The possibility that additional caches of Clara's documents remain buried, protected by Swiss neutrality and property law, creates uncertainty about historical completeness. We know that significant portions of her archive have surfaced, but we also know that portions remain missing, their existence suggested by references in recovered documents or gaps in chronology that other pages would fill. Each new discovery demonstrates that the archive is not exhausted, that more waits to be found, that historical understanding remains provisional. Vatican archives present similar frustrations for researchers. The Holy See's secret archive, recently renamed but not fundamentally changed in its access policies, contains an estimated 3,000 documents that reference Clara Petacci. These include correspondence between Vatican officials and fascist authorities, financial records of transactions between the Church and the regime, and possibly portions of Clara's diaries that were transferred to Vatican custody by her father or other intermediaries. However, Vatican policy restricts access to documents until a century has passed from their creation, meaning Clara-related materials will not become available to researchers until April 28, 2045, exactly 100 years after her death. This century-long seal ensures that everyone mentioned in Clara's documents, everyone who might be embarrassed or incriminated by their contents, will be dead before the information becomes public. It is institutional protection not of the documents but of reputations, a recognition that truth can be delayed until it is no longer dangerous to living interests. The Vatican has used this approach with many sensitive collections, acknowledging the historical value of materials while protecting the Church and its associates from immediate consequences of revelation. Researchers working on Clara's archive have catalogued not just what has been found, but what remains missing, creating inventories of absence based on references in recovered documents. Clara mentions diary volumes that have never surfaced. She references letters to specific individuals that have not been found among recovered correspondence. She describes photographs she kept of meetings and events, images that would provide visual documentation but that have never appeared. Each reference to missing materials creates a target for future searches, a hope that these items survived and might yet be recovered. The economic implications of Clara's knowledge continue to generate legal activity across continents. Swiss banks hold dormant accounts worth an estimated $2 billion in today's currency. Accounts accessible only with information Clara possessed, but that has not been completely recovered from her. Surviving documents. Italian courts process claims from families whose property was confiscated based on lists Clara maintained. Litigation that requires access to her records to verify or dispute claims. Art dealers trace stolen masterpieces using her inventory of gifts Mussolini received and redistributed. Documentation that helps establish provenance and rightful ownership. 7 governments, including the United States, United Kingdom, and Italy, maintain classified files about Clara's interrogation and documents, suggesting that revelations from her archive still threaten powerful interests or ongoing operations. Former CIA operative Miles Copeland claimed in 1989 that Clara's complete diary would rewrite the accepted history of World War II's end and embarrass every Allied government. This statement, made decades after events by someone with access to intelligence assessments, suggests that American authorities understood the full scope of what Clara knew and recognized how dangerous that knowledge remained. Copeland's statement has been cited by researchers as evidence that significant portions of Clara's archive exist in classified government collections, withheld from public access because of continuing political sensitivities. Each decade brings new discoveries, new technologies for recovering information from damaged documents, new legal battles over access to archives, and new revelations that complicate established narratives. The process is not linear or complete. Fragments surface, provide insight, raise new questions, then force researchers to wait years or decades for additional fragments that might provide answers. This ongoing incompleteness means that Clara Petacci's story remains open, still being written through the gradual emergence of the documentary record she created 8 decades ago. The survival and surfacing of Clara's archive demonstrates that suppression of historical evidence is ultimately futile. Information wants to persist, documents find ways to endure, and secrets eventually surface, even when powerful forces work to keep them buried. Clara's tricolour diary system, her distribution of documents across multiple hiding places, her final act of carrying testimony on her body. All of these choices were made by someone who understood that knowledge survives physical death, that documentation can speak across decades, that bearing witness creates permanent record regardless of what authorities attempt to conceal. When we attempt to understand historical figures, we face the challenge of separating the person from the mythology that accumulates around them. Clara Petacci has been portrayed as romantic martyr, as fascist enabler, as innocent bystander to evil, as calculating opportunist. Each portrayal contains elements of truth, and each obscures dimensions that contradict simple categorization. What emerges from careful examination of her diaries, from analysis of her choices, from study of what she knew and how she used that knowledge, is a figure more complex and more significant than any single characterization can capture. Clara occupies a unique position in the historical record. She was neither politician nor spy, neither official participant in governance nor detached observer. She existed in a space that formal history rarely captures well, the intimate space where power shows its private face. Politicians maintain public personas, officials operate within bureaucratic structures, spies work within intelligence frameworks. Clara had access to what existed behind and beneath all of these formal structures. She saw Mussolini when the dictator could be simply a man, frightened and failing. She witnessed the regime's machinery without being part of its official operation. She gained knowledge without having official channels or authorization. She was, in the most precise sense, a witness, someone present in crucial moments without being a participant in crucial decisions. Her diaries reveal this unique perspective with remarkable clarity. She documented Mussolini crying after ordering executions, emotion that would never appear in official records or public accounts. She described him vomiting before speeches, physical manifestation of stress that contradicted the confident strongman image carefully projected to the Italian people. She recorded him praying to a god he publicly rejected, private spirituality hidden beneath official atheism. These observations capture the human reality behind political performance, the fear and doubt that coexist with authoritarian display. No official record would contain this information because such displays of vulnerability never occurred before officials. Clara saw what was hidden from everyone else, and she wrote it down. The human machinery behind fascism's facade emerges clearly through her documentation. The drugs maintaining the strongman image, the chemical interventions necessary to sustain the illusion of vitality and control, the body doubles attending dangerous events, stand-ins who allowed Mussolini to appear in multiple places or to avoid personal risk while maintaining the fiction of fearless leadership. The fortune-tellers consulted before military campaigns, a superstitious dimension to decision-making that would have contradicted the regime's emphasis on rational modernity and strength. Through Clara's eyes, we see power's private decomposition, the gap between projection and reality that all authoritarian systems must maintain, but that witnesses like Clara can document. What transforms Clara from historical curiosity to essential source is understanding that her perspective was not available through any other means. Historians rely on official documents, recorded decisions, diplomatic correspondence, military orders. These sources capture formal aspects of governance but miss the human dimension, the private thoughts and fears that drive public actions. Clara provided what formal sources cannot. Intimate observation of power's private face, documentation of moments when the performance could be set aside, records of the person beneath the persona. The financial implications of Clara's knowledge continue to generate litigation and investigation 8 decades after her death. Swiss banks hold dormant accounts worth an estimated $2 billion in today's currency, accounts that Mussolini established, but that Clara knew how to access. These accounts were designed to require dual authorization, both Mussolini's signature and Clara's, ensuring that neither could access the funds without the other. This arrangement was both practical and symbolic, binding them together financially as they were bound romantically. With both dead, the accounts became frozen, inaccessible to anyone without the specific authentication information that died with them. The ongoing legal battles over these accounts involve multiple parties with competing claims. The Italian government argues that Mussolini's assets belong to the state, that any accounts he controlled should be seized as state property. Families whose wealth was confiscated by the fascist regime claim that some portion of these accounts derived from their stolen property, that restitution requires access to these funds. Clara's surviving relatives argue inheritance rights, though this claim is complicated by the fact that the accounts were in Mussolini's name with Clara as co-signatory rather than joint owner. Swiss banks, for their part, maintain that without proper authentication, the accounts remain frozen, serving no party's interests but protecting the banks from liability for releasing funds to wrong claimants. Italian courts process hundreds of claims based on Clara's documented lists of confiscated property. Her diaries included inventories of artwork, real estate, businesses, and other assets that the fascist regime seized from political enemies, racial minorities, and families who simply possessed wealth the regime wanted. These inventories were Clara's creation, her attempt to track what Mussolini acquired and how he distributed these spoils among supporters and allies. The lists were not complete, but they were detailed enough to support legal claims by families attempting to recover property or receive compensation for losses. Each court case requires authenticating Clara's documentation, establishing that her records accurately reflected regime actions, demonstrating connection between listed property and specific families making claims. Art dealers and museums have used Clara's records to trace stolen masterpieces, paintings and sculptures that disappeared during the war and surfaced decades later in private collections or even public institutions. Clara's inventory of gifts Mussolini received and redistributed provides provenance documentation, chains of custody that help establish whether artworks in circulation today were legitimately acquired or were stolen property. Her records have helped recover dozens of significant artworks, returning them to rightful owners or their heirs. But her inventory also reveals how much remains missing, how many pieces left Italy during the war and have not been located, suggesting that continued searching might recover additional treasures. 7 governments maintain classified files about Clara Petacci, documents that remain restricted despite decades having passed since the events they describe. These classifications suggest that information about Clara's knowledge, about her interrogation, about documents she possessed, continues to threaten interests that governments feel obligated to protect. What could remain sensitive 8 decades later? The most likely explanations involve ongoing family legacies of individuals, Clara named as collaborators or traitors, intelligence methods that were used to recover her documents that remain operational, or financial arrangements that have not expired, and that involve institutions or families still prominent today. The United States classified portions of its intelligence files on Clara and keeps them restricted despite Freedom of Information Act requests from historians. The justification provided is that release would harm foreign relations or reveal intelligence sources and methods. The foreign relations concern likely involves allies mentioned in Clara's documents as having collaborated with fascists, embarrassing details that the U.S. government prefers to keep concealed to maintain current diplomatic relationships. The intelligence sources and methods concern might involve how the CIA obtained Clara's diary pages in the 1950s, operations that involved people whose families or associates might face consequences if full details were revealed. Britain similarly maintains classified files, though some portions have been released with heavy redactions. The redacted sections appear to involve British officers and officials mentioned in Clara's recovered documents as having assisted Mussolini's rise to power in the 1920s. These early supporters of fascism saw Mussolini as a bulwark against communism, as a leader who would stabilize Italy and protect British interests in the Mediterranean. That British intelligence and diplomatic personnel actively aided fascism's establishment is historically embarrassing. Conflicts with Britain's later role as staunch anti-fascist force and involves families whose descendants might prefer these associations remain obscure. Italy's classification of Clara-related documents is particularly extensive, covering not just intelligence materials but court records, investigative files, and government correspondence. The Italian government's sensitivity likely stems from the fact that many prominent post-war Italian political figures had connections to the fascist regime, connections that Clara's documents might expose in embarrassing detail. Italy's transition from fascist dictatorship to democracy involved a degree of continuity. Former fascist officials finding places in new democratic structures, and Clara's testimony threatens the comfortable narratives of clean breaks and complete transformations. Former CIA operative Miles Copeland's statement that Clara's complete diary would rewrite the accepted history of World War II's end and embarrass every Allied government carries weight because it comes from someone who had access to intelligence assessments of what she knew. Copeland was not a historian working from public sources but an intelligence professional who understood what Clara's documents revealed about Allied conduct. His statement suggests that the most explosive material in Clara's archive involves not fascist crimes, which are well documented through other sources, but Allied complicity, compromise, and corruption. It is Allied embarrassment, not Axis revelation, that keeps files classified and documents restricted. Clara's story transforms our understanding of historical truth itself. She was compromised by her relationship with Mussolini, tainted by proximity to evil, implicated in the regime she observed. Yet she possessed truth unavailable through any other source. This paradox challenges assumptions about whose testimony historians should trust. We want witnesses to be neutral, objective, untainted by association with evil, but the witnesses with the most valuable testimony are often those most deeply compromised. Clara knew what she knew precisely because of her compromised position, because she was intimate with power rather than distant from it. She knew but did not create, an important distinction that does not absolve her but does clarify her role. She witnessed decisions but did not make them. She documented atrocities but did not order them. She benefited from evil but did not initiate it. This nuanced position is uncomfortable for historical assessment because it resists simple moral judgment. Clara was neither hero nor villain, but something more ambiguous, someone whose complicity and value coexist without cancelling each other. She loved, but did not excuse, if her diaries are taken as complete testimony. She recorded Mussolini's crimes with the same precision she recorded her devotion. She documented both the private man she adored and the public leader whose policies brought suffering across continents. This dual documentation suggests that Clara did not require reconciling these aspects, did not feel that love demanded blindness, or that observation required emotional distance. She held both realities simultaneously, loved and witnessed, devoted and documenting. Clara died at 33, an age when most people have decades ahead, when life seems far from its conclusion. She died taking secrets that might have changed justice at Nuremberg, the war crimes trials that attempted to hold Axis leaders accountable. Her testimony about Allied corruption, about British support for fascism's rise, about American business collaboration, about Vatican financial dealings, all of this could have complicated the moral clarity that Nuremberg attempted to establish. The trials portrayed a simple narrative of Allied good confronting Axis evil. Clara's knowledge revealed a more complex reality of compromise, complicity, and corruption that existed on all sides. Her silence might have altered the Cold War's beginning, the immediate post-war period when former allies became adversaries. Clara knew about Soviet infiltration of partisan movements, about communist plans for post-war Italy, about the extent to which Moscow directed resistance operations. This information, if revealed, might have changed Western perceptions of communist intentions, might have accelerated Cold War tensions, might have affected the political settlements that shaped post-war Europe. Her choice to die with this knowledge intact may have served Soviet interests, though whether Clara intended this outcome is unknowable. Her testimony could have exposed democracy's deals with fascism, the various accommodations and collaborations that democratic governments made with authoritarian regimes, when strategic interests aligned. This exposure would have undermined moral narratives that sustained democratic legitimacy in the post-war period, would have forced public reckoning with choices governments preferred to forget. Clara's silence allowed these deals to remain hidden, allowed simplified narratives to persist, allowed democracies to claim moral superiority without confronting their own compromises. Every fragment of her archive that surfaces adds complexity to simple narratives of good versus evil. History prefers clarity, wants heroes and villains, needs narratives that provide moral lessons and clear distinctions. Clara's documents resist these preferences. They reveal that nothing was as simple as official histories suggest, that all parties made compromises, that evil and good were not cleanly separated but intermingled in ways that challenge comfortable judgments. Each new discovery forces reconsideration of established narratives, demands more nuanced understanding, complicates the simple stories that nations tell themselves about their past. In choosing death over revelation, Clara Petacci became history's ultimate secret keeper, her silence as powerful as any testimony she might have provided. She could have bargained, could have traded knowledge for survival, could have become the star witness in trials and investigations that would have captivated the world. Instead, she chose to carry her knowledge to execution, to let secrets die with her, to preserve silence that has shaped historical understanding for 8 decades. This choice, whatever its motivations, had enormous consequences. It protected guilty parties, enabled some criminals to escape justice, allowed false narratives to persist. But it also preserved Clara's agency, allowed her to control her final act, ensured that she would be remembered not just for what she knew, but for what she chose not to reveal. The ultimate question Clara's story raises is about the nature of historical witness. Whose testimony should we trust? How do we evaluate sources who are compromised but uniquely informed? Clara was morally tainted by her association with Mussolini, but she was also uniquely positioned to document truth. Rejecting her testimony because of her compromised position means losing access to truth unavailable elsewhere. Accepting her testimony requires acknowledging that valuable historical evidence comes from imperfect, complicated, morally ambiguous sources. This tension is not unique to Clara but is fundamental to historical methodology, a permanent challenge in evaluating and using primary sources. Clara Petacci remains 8 decades after her death, a figure who fascinates precisely because she resists easy categorization. She was witness to evil, keeper of secrets, woman in love, creator of invaluable historical records, collaborator with fascism, victim of execution, and eternal enigma. Her story connects the intimate and the historical, demonstrates how personal relationships shape political events, shows how one person's choices to observe and document can illuminate decades for historians yet to be born. The fragments of her archive that survive, the portions still hidden, the secrets she died protecting, all continue to shape our understanding of World War II's end, of fascism's inner workings, of the complex moral landscape where love, loyalty, and observation of evil intersect. As each decade brings new discoveries from her scattered archive, Clara speaks across time with increasing authority. The woman who once waited in the rain for a glimpse of power became history's most informed bystander to that power's catastrophic exercise and ultimate collapse. She transformed from obsessed teenager to keeper of knowledge that nations still struggle to control. She created, perhaps without fully intending to, a documentary record that will continue forcing reconsideration of World War II's European theatre for decades to come, perhaps centuries, as portions of her archive continue surfacing from drainage pipes, Swiss vaults, Vatican libraries, and classified intelligence files. Her final choice, to die with secrets intact rather than trade them for survival, ensured that she would be remembered not just as Mussolini's mistress, but as history's ultimate witness, whose silence speaks as loudly as revelation, whose absence shapes understanding as profoundly as presence, whose story remains incomplete and therefore perpetually compelling, waiting for the next fragment to surface and add another dimension to truth. This is the story of Clara Petacci, the woman who loved evil, witnessed its private face, documented its machinery, and chose silence at the moment when revelation might have changed everything. Her legacy is not in the answers she provided, but in the questions she left behind. Mysteries that historians chase through archives and excavations. Truths that governments keep classified. Knowledge that died with her, but that somehow persists through the scattered fragments of her extraordinary archive. She remains, in death as in life, the woman who knew too much, whose knowledge was worth dying for, whose secrets continue shaping history 8 decades after execution silenced her voice, but failed to eliminate her testimony.